Okay, so I want to talk to you about what's happening on the optics and Ethernet speeds. And this is actually a fairly complicated subject because there's the Ethernet speed that's advancing, then there's the lane speed of the optics that's advancing, the electrical lanes on the silicon that's advancing, the modules that are making a transition, and then I want to spend some time on one particular optics, which is Gigabit Ethernet and FR1. So starting with the Ethernet port speeds, these are the ports you see coming out of the boxes we sell. 40 gig peak last year. It's in a fairly steep decline this year. 100 gigabit is in a very, very rapid growth this year, ramping from less than 1 million ports in the market last year to more than 5 million this year, and expected to be more than 10 million, maybe even 12 million next year. This is actually the fastest growing Ethernet standard in terms of revenue growth ever. And then 400 gig will kick in at the very, very end of 2018 and ramp during 19 into 20. It will not ramp as quickly as the 100 gig because it will be more expensive than 100 gig ports. So 100 gig will continue to ship at high volume, but eventually it will cross over perhaps in 21. Now, as far as the cloud networks are concerned, today it's all 100 gig, and people use copper cables in the rack, AOC cables from the top of rack to the leaf switch, either CDM4 or PSM4 to the spine, LR4 or the DCO kind of color Z optics for the metro. The 400 gig picture looks exactly the same. In fact, cloud customers will be able to retain the existing wiring or fiber installations and simply upgrade the speed per link by 4x. Copper cables on the bottom, AOC cables, either DR4, FR4, this is parallel or duplex to the spine, and then DCO, which is a digital current optics, which will go at least 100 kilometer in the metro. So I think that picture is fairly clear, and I should give credit to Brad Booth and Tom Isenhood from Microsoft, who presented this, I think 4 years ago, at the IEEE meeting when the 400 gig standard first got started. Now, there was a lot of debate at the IEEE what should be the optics, and part of the problem with the IEEE, to be honest, is it takes 3 years or longer to finish the standard. So when the effort started, people actually started defining it as 16 by 25 gig optics, which nobody's ever going to use. Then there's a whole bunch of 8 by 50 gig optics, which people are working on, but at this point it's also not clear they will be used in volume, because the only thing that makes actually sense is to go straight to 100 gig per lane. And there's a new multi-source agreement known as the 100 gig Lambda MSA that we are a part of, that was announced yesterday. And their job is to fill in the optics that the IEEE forgot to spec out, which are all the ones to do 100 gig per lane, 2 kilometers, 10 kilometers, and so on. So there are 22 founding members of this, all the important players, but the charter here is to do things that are 100 gig per lane, per optical lane, 100 gig 2 kilometer, 100 gig FR, 10 kilometer, 100 gig LR, 400 gig over 2 kilometers, 100 gig FR4. And it is understood that all of these 100 gig Lambda optics are lower cost, lower power, and and importantly, forwards compatible with future 100 gig electrical lanes. This is a little chart in light blue is the ones that the IEEE did include in the standard, which was 100 gig DR and 400 gig DR4. The yellow ones is the ones that were missing, and we don't need to dwell on the politics of that. But bottom line, as far as end customers concerned, they will be able to go straight from, say, 100 gig CDM4 or PSM4 today to 100 gig FR4 and DR4 over the same fiber installed base. And what is important to understand is that the 8-lane standards, LR8 and FR8, are not optically interoperable with 4-lane standards. They have 8 wavelengths, not 4. Now, again, this is lower cost, lower power when it gets there. It doesn't quite line up with the Ethernet chip lane transitions, the ones that come out of the silicon. So today, everything we're shipping is 25 gig lanes. 4x25 is 100 gig port. Single lane is 25 gig. The next silicon generation that's showing up end of 18 is 50 gig lanes. So 100 gig is only 2 lanes of 50. 200 gig would be 4 lanes of 50. 400 gig will be 8 lanes. And then we expect to see 2 years later 100 gig electrical lanes. So a single lane is 100 gig, 4 lanes 400 gig, 8 lanes 800 gig. We tried to model this a little bit in terms of what this means in terms of the market. Obviously 10 gig is still shipping today, 10 gig lanes are declining. The bulk of what's shipping certainly by next year is 25 gig. And we do believe that's actually peaking in 18 and will then start declining in 19 and 20. And then the 50 gig PAM4 kicks in, and eventually the 100 gig kicks in late 2020 and will ramp to higher volumes in 21 and 22. Now, the trick here is that the IEEE takes 3 years to define new standards, and there is actually no standard for, believe it or not, 400 gig electrical lanes. Luckily, one doesn't have to change the IEEE standard for 50 lanes. You just have to pick 1 lane for 100 gig, 2 lanes for 200 gig, 4 lanes for 400 gig. All these definitions exist today. In fact, there's an 8-lane definition, which is 8 by 50 today, which would actually map to an 800 gig. What is required is, of course, is the electrical lane spec, known as the OIF-CIA 112G VSR, very short reach electrical interface, which goes from that switch silicon through the PC board to the optical module. There's proposals for that. There's only a very few vendors that actually make this IP, the SERDES IP, that goes into these things. So we do believe that as long as these vendors can agree on the spec, it will actually work. It certainly works in simulation. I should also mention here, beyond 100 or 112 gig, it gets really, really challenging, in fact, perhaps impossible. So this may be the highest electrical speed we'll ever see, and this will probably last many, many years to come. So going now back to the matching the silicon lanes to the optical lanes, it's clear that the silicon transitions drive the optics transitions, because you really don't want to go backwards in speed and tie up a slower speed optics to a faster silicon. This requires a so-called inverse gearbox, which takes a lot of power and board space. Now you can go faster on the optics than the SERDES speed, but that's a forward gearbox. And that makes sense because then the optics are forwards compatible, or you can match the silicon speed. So those are the 3 cases. Now, to give you an example of what this actually means is today, 25 gig silicon, maybe there's a retimer or not, but it drives, say, a C11.4 optics. This will take about 4 watts, not counting the silicon, but the optics portion at the 12 volt level. If there was a 50 gig PAM4 chip in the next generation and you need an inverse gearbox, the power actually goes up because that inverse gearbox takes about 2.5 watts per channel, per 100 gig channel. And then for the 100 gig case, it still goes, it's a little less power hungry, but roughly the same. Now, oops, we saw that. So on the other hand, if we had 100 gig DR, and I'm getting ahead of here now, the single channel one, we would need a gearbox, of course, today to go from 25 to 100 gig, but that total power is less than a C11.4. In the case of 2x50, the power goes down because it's only 2 lanes instead of 4 lanes. And for the 100 gig case, it's a very simple retimer. So this is sort of the progression you want to see, that as technology progresses, power goes down instead of power going up. Now, again, there's this 2-year period where the electrical lanes are 50 gig primarily, and then eventually will be 100 gig. And obviously you want optics that interoperate across these boundaries. So the key point here is that the 50 gig silicon lane speed is a very interim short step in the big picture, and the 100 gig, because it's lower power and low cost, will gain market share when that comes out. And we do believe that the vast majority of 400 gig ports that will ship over time will use 100 gig lane interfaces. As a better example of what this means at the module level, for initial 400 gig 8x50 module, an FR4 or DR4 optics is roughly 10 watts at the 12 volt level. With the 100 gig serial interface, the power per channel, per 400 gig channel, will drop to about 6 watts. You can then actually put 2 of these channels into one module, which is more cost effective. So the module power goes up, but the power per function goes down significantly. Which leads us to the OSFP, which is another MSA which we initiated, that is standardizing a form factor that can handle both 56 and 112 or 50 and 100 gig PAM4 lanes, and is the only known high-density pluggable form factor that can actually do this, being able to deliver up to 28 terabits in a 1U box with 100 gig interfaces. We have measured this in lab up to 15 watts power, so we can handle these dual type of modules, and it can also handle, of course, other high power modules such as DCOs. So the initial use cases are, copper cables through metro reach. The digital coherent optics, we believe, will actually be quite popular because it allows people to configure metro ports at the same density as switch ports for the in a data center. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the bulk of the 400 gig volume will be 100 gig electrical lanes. So the form factor better works with this. This is an example of the DCO. These chips are still in development, but a single chip will drive 400 gig 16 QAM, which is going to be a standardized function. And the estimated power for that is less than 15 watts. And again, this plugs into the high density line cards. DR4 is what people do initially for the 8 fiber parallel. FR4 and LR4 will do the duplex fiber. Dual versions of this, which will come in 2020, will double up on this with 2 connectors. And one could also do 800 gig. We don't quite know it whether 800 gig Ethernet will be happening here. The optics will be there. It's actually not very difficult, but the commitment on the silicon side isn't quite made yet. Now, there's a lot of questions, why are there 2 form factors out there? Ours is the OSFP. There's another group called the QSFP-DD, which is essentially a QSFP with 2 rows of connectors, which both support 8 lanes. Both supports 36 ports per 1U. They both are backwards compatible with QSFPs. We need a mechanical adapter, but you can actually plug it in. The difference is thermal performance and electrical performance. As far as we know, the QSFP-DD has a heck of a time to get going at 50 gig. And as far as we know, it's not going to work at 100 gig. Also, in terms of thermals, we have actually built 2 equivalent systems, one with 32 ports of OSFP, one with 32 ports of QSFP, measure them in the same wind tunnel with the same kind of thermal modules. And what we found was there's about a 30 to 40% difference in thermal capability between the OSFP and the QSFP. And that is a problem if you want to plug in a DCO. There's another issue, which is the OSFP is a built-in heatsink. The QSFP relies on writing heatsinks, and the thermal interface between the module and the writing heatsink isn't that well defined, which means it really has to be derated, in which case the thermal gap becomes more like 50 to 60%. The final problem, and we hate to point out all these problems with the QSFP, is they actually ran out of interior volume for more advanced optics, which has led to a recent Type 2 module, which sticks out by extra 15 millimeters in front of the Type 1 to provide more interior volume. But the problem is there's no heatsink or no managed airflow outside of the chassis. So it's kind of a really bad place to put components that require heat. Anyway, the bottom line is we believe the QSFP-DD is basically a one-trick pony, which works for 2 years. And the hallmark of any successful optics form factor in history has been a long life cycle. For example, the SFP started in 2000 with a 1 gig definition, then upgraded to 10 gig, 25 gig, 50 gig next year, and 100 gig. So we'll actually have scaled 100-fold in 20 years, which is quite amazing. The QSFP started originally, I guess, as a 10 gig thing as well, but more recently as a 40 gig, 100 gig. It will scale to 200 gig. In fact, we believe it can support 400 gig in 2000. I'm sorry, this should say 2020, but it's not the densest thing. The OSFP is double the density of a QSFP and will support either 2x400 or 800 gig interfaces. And then the QSFP is basically limited to the 8x50. Let me switch back to the 100 gig DR and FR, which is sort of an important topic. So again, next year, the silicon goes to 50 gig PAM4. You can still support the old CWM4 optics with an inverse gearbox that takes 2.5 watts per 100 gig. And then you need, this is actually to do DR1, right? Then you have a forward gearbox to go from 4x25 to 100 gig. And the optics themselves, the optics is very low power, but the sum of these things adds up to 5.5 watts at the 12 volt level. Whereas if you start with 2x50, you just need the forward gearbox, which doesn't have to recompute the forward error correction because it's part of the new spec. And the total power is 2.5 watts, which saves, 3 watts, which at that time will be roughly 20 to 25% of the total system power. So there really isn't a good reason to do this, but this is sort of what the industry is struggling with, which is all the installed base today is 4x25, and that's the optics people have bought. We do believe the 100 gig DR and FR optics will be significantly lower power and, of course, lower cost as well. Now, there's other things we'll need for 2x50. We need AOC cables, copper cables, that's easy. Duplex multi-mode fiber, people are working on that, and of course the duplex single-mode fiber. But with those four things, you can pretty much replace the current optical set on 100 gig. Again, there's two form factors here being proposed. One is the micro QSFP, which actually has 4 lanes, but you can just use 2 of them, which has a very good electrical connector and very good thermal performance with a good heatsink. The other one is a new consortium was just announced called OSFP-DD, which looks like an SFP, but it added another row of connectors to get another set of channels. This is, again, has a weaker electrical performance and has some thermal challenges, but both may exist in the market. The way this will play out in our mind is that the 4x25 QSFP will peak out in 18 or thereabouts, and then decline both because 100 gig is declining, but also because these newer 2x50 form factors will kick in. So when I say QSFP, I meant either micro QSFP or the SFP-DD. And those will peak out probably in 2020 when the 1x100 kicks in, which is going to be, oh, typo, should say just SFP. This is the problem when I do the slides in the last minute. So we may see 2 transitions here, but the point of this is that over the rest of the 100 gig lifetime, the 100 gig DR volume is far greater than the historical volume of 4-lane by 4x25. So again, the optics vendors, we're just trying to catch up with the demand right now, are kind of scratching their heads how to do all this stuff, but it is easier to build DR1 modules than 4-lane modules in terms of the optical assembly and the optical yield. Use cases for this is, for example, on the top of rack. By the time this gets to 100 gig in 2019, copper cables get kind of challenging, so optics may actually play a role here, and 100 gig optics will be fairly common for that, we think. But the bottom line of all of this is economics. Lower cost, lower power drives adoption. And again, the 100 gig DR and 400 gig DR4, which are, by the way, interoperate. You can take a 400 gig DR4 and split it with a splitter cable into 4 channels of 100 gig DR1 are very good ways to cover that market. And I think that's actually my last slide. We have seen patterns where old optics typically fall down by half within 18 months after the peak. This has been true for 40 gig, certainly. We think this may also be true for 100 gig QSFP. But what is clear is that QSFP is actually obsolete after 2019 because it's inherently tied to that 4x25 gig install base.
Yes, sir. So migration from NRZ to PAM4 was painful and long process. Going to 100 gig electrical lines, you think will be done in 2 years?
Yeah, see, the issue is economics, right? So what we know is people very quickly migrate to products that are cheaper, less power. We have seen this on the 10 gig to 25 gig transition or the 40 gig to 100 gig. In less than a year, maybe even 9 months or 6 months, the majority of new bookings we saw switched over to the new generation. And the new product was better in every metric. It was denser, had more features, bigger tables. I mean, there was other benefits, but when a new product is better than the old product, and assuming the software works, of course, that's a given, right? We didn't have to requalify EOS on the new product. The software was accepted by customers. The new product ramped extremely quickly, like as quickly as we could make them. It's similar in the Intel world, right? Intel announces a new CPU. There's no good reason to buy the old one because the old one is just not as good. So the transition to 50 gig will run along the same lines, and the optics have to follow that. Otherwise, you can't take full advantage of that benefit. If you have to burden the new products to go back to QSFP, you're essentially wasting a good portion of that power reduction on inverse gearboxes. And it's easier to just go forwards on the optics than backwards. At least that's our view.
Andy, you mentioned 112 gig as being a possible, like a physical limitations, and we can't go beyond that for the chip to module interface.
Well, that's on the electrical lanes on the PC board. So what happens is the losses go up to the point where the reach, the length of the trace can only be so many inches, which makes it just hard to build anything bigger. And the losses go up dramatically with higher speed. So if some people have talked about a 200 gig PAM4 standard, and then they realized you could only run it over 3 inches, which, you lose all the dB just in the package getting in and out of the package. So there will be, people will do multi-chip modules with perhaps embedded optics in 2021, 22 when
that was the question. Where do we go next?
There are other solutions at it, but traditional systems with electrical traces will probably peak out at 100 gig electrical lane speed, which is really 112, including the forward error correction.
You're forcing a transition to photonics then?
Yeah, I mean, the current topic is that the lasers are not reliable enough, and they don't really like hot temperature either. But people could just put the modulators on the chip and keep the lasers outside and make them redundant. So there may be a technical solution that works, but it does require brand new packaging at the chip level, and this needs to be tested validated before it can ramp. And nobody has built these things yet, so this will take some time.
Years.
Yeah. But people are looking at it. It's just it's easier to not have to change it. So the 100 gig generation still does that.
Today, Arista relies on third-party DSPs, Acacia in your case. Do you plan to do any in-house development?
Yeah, we're not doing chips here. It's just maybe I should have said this up front. So we firmly believe in merchant silicon and basically riding the wave of the investment that the entire industry is making. And there's usually a competition for both the switches and the DSPs. Some of the DSPs are unique in terms of their forward error correction, so they're not directly interoperable. But if you use the same chip on both sides, it will actually interoperate. So there's always multiple choices, and certain companies certainly have executed better than others. So we tend to pick the first silicon that comes out, and that tends to be what customers want.